Welcome to the Vesque Luxe Talks of Life podcast series. I'm Christopher Levesque, along with Joe Reposarda and Mike Figueroa of Vesque Luxe. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by our guest, Gerry Berkowitz, an esteemed professor of plant science at the University of Connecticut, to talk about cannabis, CBD, and related matters. So welcome, Gerry, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Sure, there's a lot of exciting developments in cannabis. Scholarship, and I'm here to talk about it.
Wonderful. So perhaps you could start then telling us what you're studying and teaching at UConn.
Okay. Well, let's see. Maybe I'll preface that with how UConn got involved with cannabis. And I teach a class on organic vegetable production. Several years ago, I tried to have the class go to visit one of the four medical marijuana grow facilities in the state of Connecticut, which are run by the Department of Consumer Protection. They rejected the request many times, but eventually, with persistence and getting a list of students for background checks, security, we were able to take a class of 40 students to a medical marijuana facility. And the heads of the facility were telling me and the students how the people they hire are from growing pot in the basement. There wasn't really any horticulture and any science applied to cannabis, from a university or from an academic perspective training. So we developed a relationship. I had the university sit down with the company, and the legal people worked out these complicated mechanisms, and we were able to have a venture capital company begin funding research at UConn in my lab. And that was really a first, because prior to 2014, no university researcher, no one could study hemp. We're talking about hemp with low THC. Legally, it was all considered marijuana until 2014, when that law changed. So I got a grant and had a graduate student working on a PhD, and I had a lot of undergraduate students lined up at the door interested in doing independent study projects. And this was really quite it wasn't like I want to learn how to grow pot. There was a certain respect for how interesting it would be to apply horticulture to cannabis. At the time, no university taught any course on growing cannabis. There were courses in law schools, courses for medical practitioners, but no course in growing cannabis. There were lots of courses online, but nothing associated with the university. We decided to do that. We set up a course last year, had over 400 students register for the class.
Wow.
We taught it online last summer, and we're teaching it again in the spring now. And the course really attracted national attention and lots of interest, and I've had more grant money come in, so I have a very vigorous and active program. I have colleagues in the department who are also working on cannabis. So what I do is I study the biochemical pathways and look at how one could shift carbon, one could block cannabinoid production and leave it at, for example, one of the earlier cannabinoids in the pathway, CBG, or I could shift carbon to another of the cannabinoids like CBC, or I could block THC production completely in hemp. So there's a lot that we're studying about disease resistance, manipulating genes to make male sterile pollen, so that you wouldn't have to worry about male plants fertilizing female plants. But I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm talking about botany now, and maybe your listeners need a couple of simple explanations before we go there. So I'll let you ask another question.
So sure, what is cannabis then exactly?
Okay,
People
so
tend to
cannabis,
conflate
yeah,
cannabis, marijuana, hemp, CBD, and other concepts at this point.
cannabis, cannabis has three different species: cannabis sativa, cannabis indicus, and cannabis ruderalis. Uh, in the marijuana industry, the companies that grow marijuana and have done a lot of breeding, and they've basically there's no longer, you can no longer genetically say something is cannabis indicus or cannabis sativa. The genes have crossed enough so that there's really, commercial operations do make a distinction, but genetically, for a scientist, cannabis sativa and cannabis indica are now just cannabis. And what happened is in 2014, the Farm Bill, shepherded by Mitch McConnell, because he was looking for a way for tobacco farmers in Connecticut to have a new crop. So it was really Mitch McConnell in the Senate who led the movement to, in the Farm Bill, say a distinction between hemp, which has low THC. Hemp has 0.3% or lower THC. And marijuana simply has higher than that level of THC. For medical marijuana now, people can obtain flowers from marijuana cannabis that have up to 20% by weight cannabinoid, THC. So 0.3% was thought of as a distinction, a line. And the actual scientific basis for that line is an interesting story. If you want me to elaborate on it, probably
Sure, please.
very few people know this. But the government arbitrarily came up with 0.3% on the basis of a paper published in 1976. I have the authors, but I can't recall them right now. But what they did is, they were Canadian. They did a survey of wild cannabis growing and also medical marijuana. And what they did at the time, 1976, we had much lower levels of THC in marijuana. These days, breeders have increased it tremendously. And what's very interesting is, in their paper, they simply said, if we look at the level of THC in the leaves of the various strains of marijuana and hemp that we've analyzed, we see a broad distinction in the leaves of these plants from decades ago, where 0.3% could be sort of a benchmark. The government took that paper and applied it to decades later, after breeding not just the leaves, but the flowers. So they're saying flowers have to follow that distinction. It's really arbitrary. In fact, the authors said that this 0.3% was completely arbitrary. But right now, that's what makes a legal distinction for the first time in this country, where you could grow legal, federally legal hemp, which is below 0.3%, and anything above that would be federally illegal, no matter what states say. So does that give a good explanation for your listeners?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
Are
so
there different?
Go ahead.
I was going to ask, are there different strains of cannabis that people know?
Absolutely. The commercial interests have been busy at work for decades. None of the breeding, genetics, all the research done by companies, none of it is in the public domain. The companies aren't in the business of sharing their technologies with the public. But companies have been breeding cannabis for decades. And as a result, there's cannabis strains with very high non-psychotropic cannabinoids like CBD, and there's other strains that have high THC, which makes you high. So there's a lot of breeding that's been done by companies.
And where and how is cannabis grown most effectively? I've read about hydroponic systems, of course, natural systems, and so forth.
Basically, it's about, we could take California, which has a state legal marijuana program, and in that state, about half of the value of the state marijuana crop is from growing outdoors, and about half is grown in greenhouses. So of the net worth of the state crop in California. So that gives you a feel for, there's plenty of greenhouse and plenty of field production, but that's statistics on marijuana. Since the federal government legalized hemp, 34 states now have state hemp laws, so you can grow hemp, which has low THC, outdoors in greenhouses and be federally legal as long as it's below 0.3%. So it's a very big issue that hemp growers all over the country have to submit their flowers for testing prior to sale to the public to prove that it has low THC.
How long does it take to grow cannabis?
Well, cannabis is what's called a day length sensitive plant. And people extract all of the important compounds from female flowers. First of all, cannabis has male and female plants, typically, and so a plant can be female with only female flowers, or male with male flowers. And the flowering period is initiated by short days. So if you grow a crop in July or June, by September, October, the day length has changed, and that's a signal to the plant to flower. So you can grow cannabis in a greenhouse, and what they'll do is they'll change it to short days. They'll put cloth over the greenhouse to cut the day length to induce it to flower. You
basically signaling the plant, yeah.
Yeah, it's a way to manipulate the plant. Or you can grow it, and then in the fall, the change in the day length will initiate flowering. The flowering typically can be over a 7-week period. So you can grow the plant for 4, 5, 6 weeks, or other times, but that's a good estimate, and then shift it to a flowering cycle, or put it in a room called a reproductive room, and you shift the lights to induce flowering, and then 7 weeks later you harvest.
Now, the distinction between male, female, and we see references from time to time to seedless forms of cannabis, how do they relate to the production of CBD?
Yes, a good question. So CBD is just one, along with THC, another of the major cannabinoids in cannabis. Basically, however the genetics are set up by the plant will produce these endpoint cannabinoids. With breeding, they can shift the precursors to produce THC or CBD, and that happens in the flower. And if the flower is not pollinated, if you have female flowers that without any male pollen around to cause the flower to make seed, then a lot more of the carbon goes to make cannabinoids. So you want it used to be called sinsemilla, which is unfertilized female flowers. That's the vast majority of cannabis that's grown for either marijuana or for CBD production. So these are endpoint cannabinoids. There's a lot of other cannabinoids, but those CBD and THC are two of the major cannabinoids.
Okay.
Gerry, I think just for the listeners as well and the viewers to differentiate a male and a female plant, does the male produce seeds versus the female only buds? I'd like to clear that up as well because I always hear that question come up.
So the female plant has flowers that have ovaries, and in order to be pollinated, they'll require pollen. The male plant has flowers that produce pollen. So one male plant can produce millions of pollen grains and could fertilize hundreds of female flowers in the field. So these days, it requires an awful lot of labor for any grower of hemp or medical marijuana to go ahead and kill all the male plants before they release pollen. So that's a lot of labor. And what the industry has done is made feminized seed. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you asked about the male and the female and the flowers. Typically, the cannabis plant has a female or a male, where they just have male flowers or female flowers. And what you're commercially doing is you're harvesting unpollinated female flowers that don't have any seed. And you want to prevent pollen from being near female flowers because you don't want the flowers to be pollinated and make seed.
Great.
Interesting.
That makes sense. Well, I know you also mentioned a couple different cannabinoids. You spoke about CBG and CBC. What are cannabinoids and how many are there? No, there's many of them out there.
Cannabinoids are only made in the cannabis plant. They're a special secondary metabolite. Plants are really magical chemical factories. Plants make more interesting chemicals than humans have sorted out yet. Cannabis makes a family of compounds called cannabinoids. And those cannabinoids bind, interestingly enough, to a receptor in our central nervous system, in our brains. That cannabinoid, that receptor is called the endocannabinoid receptor 1. In the central nervous system, that cannabinoid receptor, when something is bound to it, will send out nerve signals that make you high. So cannabinoids evolution has bred cannabinoids, just like hot pepper, like chili peppers with capsaicin. The plants evolve to mess around with animals. So whether it's making peppers that have a very caustic compound that activates your pain receptors, or cannabinoids, which activate a cannabinoid receptor in your brain. That's what plants do. That's what evolution does. It's interesting that a plant designed the compound that binds to a receptor in our brains to make us high.
Fascinating, yeah.
It is very interesting. Now, how many cannabinoids do we have right now? How many have we discovered so
There's,
far?
I think, well over 100, but many are minor. And we really haven't categorized the cannabinoids, the minor cannabinoids. The major cannabinoids are THC, which is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, CBD, which is cannabidiol, and CBC, which is cannabichrome, I think it's called. So those are the major cannabinoids, but there's many, many minor ones. Some people believe that the pharmaceutical properties of cannabis and other properties like how it makes you high, different feelings you get from marijuana are all based on many cannabinoids together, along with terpenes. And together, that's called the entourage effect. So some people believe for medical applications, it'll be very important to use extracts of the plant rather than a purified compound. And if you go to health food stores, you'll be well aware of that oftentimes it's a extract of a plant rather than a specific vitamin that'll be medically efficacious. So that some people believe that's the case with cannabis, and there's a lot to learn.
Very interesting. I just heard you mention terpenes. That's always been a conversation that's been popping up recently. Can you explain a little bit what are terpenes?
Terpenes are they're volatile compounds produced by many, many plants. And volatile means that they evaporate into the air. So it's actually the terpenes that give cannabis their classic smell, odor. And the terpenes are compounds like limonene, pinene, and you could tell from their names, limonene is a lemon smell. Pinene is a pine smell. So all of those odors that you smell in plants, typically they're terpenes. So there's quite a few terpenes in cannabis. They're made in many different plants as opposed to cannabinoids. And it's thought that the terpenes modify the effects of the cannabinoids on people, on their brains. But that's also not really clearly, that's not supported by a lot of science right now.
Very interesting stuff. And going back to cannabinoids, I know we have mentioned a lot CBD. Can we get a little more in depth with CBD? What exactly is CBD?
Sure. CBD is a cannabinoid that's absolutely been shown not to bind to the cannabinoid receptor in your central nervous system that THC binds to. So CBD is referred to as a non-psychotropic cannabinoid. However, CBD is accepted by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, as being efficacious, as being medically useful to control seizures in children. That's the first medical application of CBD that was accepted was the use of CBD for treatment of a certain kind of brain. It affects seizures. Mm-hmm. So even though it doesn't bind to the cannabinoid receptor in your brain, the one we know, there could be what's called a rogue receptor. We don't know what CBD binds to. But it's really wrong to think that CBD doesn't affect your brain if it prevents seizures. So it's definitely doing something, just not making you high. Now, CBD has been linked to other very good or very important medical interventions with people in terms of pain, in terms of, let's see, there's some studies that are linking it to digestion. There's another receptor in your body besides the central nervous receptor, and it's more in your immune system and your digestive tract, and that's called CB2, cannabinoid receptor 2. We're not sure if CBD binds to CBD2, but it definitely is doing something. So CBD is a compound that the federal government accepts is not medically dangerous, that doesn't make you high, and has some medical purposes. And for a long time, cannabis was classified as a Schedule I drug, which means that it had no medical usefulness. CBD changes that.
Great, yeah, and Gerry, we've talked a lot about the terpenes and how this plant has a lot of good stuff packed in it. I'd like to switch to now the topic around soil and biodiversity. What are you seeing that this plant actually does to the biodiversity in the soil?
Well, I'm hearing some good things. I've gone to quite a few meetings over the last couple of years where hemp growers are reporting their results. Now, first of all, since the U.S. government hasn't supported hemp research in decades, we're not sure what are the best varieties to grow in Connecticut, in Kentucky. We just don't know. So scientists at agriculture colleges are testing European varieties and others, but we're working that out right now. And what we're hearing is that the hemp cannabis plant does good things for the soil. It's got a very strong taproot. It keeps the soil in a healthy situation. We also hear from farmers that hemp cannabis does not do well in wet soils. So in wet soils, you get big losses. And other than those two facts, the fact that hemp root systems are healthy for the soil, hemp doesn't particularly take any particular mineral out of the soil, so you could consider it not problematic, and it could be part of a cropping system.
So is that why we're seeing farmers starting to rotate this growing cycle into their current plant cycle?
Well,
I've seen some articles
yeah.
that indicate that's being done in certain farms.
We're seeing that because of the law in 2018 basically legalized hemp. So only federally. So only in 2018, the federal government say it's legal to grow hemp. So it's starting now, and growers who grow hemp for CBD production the value of the crop could be $50,000 an acre. In a state like Connecticut, where you have high taxes, high land values, it's a really good crop because it has high value per acre. Hemp could also be grown for fiber, and I'm excluding that from this conversation. Hemp for fiber is a different crop. It's only worth a couple $100 an acre, and you need an infrastructure to process the fiber. So in Connecticut and in many other states, the majority of hemp growers are growing unfertilized female plants with harvesting flowers to extract CBD, and CBD makes it worth that $50,000 an acre.
And is that an easy process or a difficult one?
It's not simple, and each state has its own rules, but right now there's processors that are developing and expanding commercial flower processing facilities. So there's a separate industry. In the state of Connecticut, you get a processor hemp license or a farmer hemp license. But it's another part of the industry right now is people who are setting up extraction plants to make CBD oil.
Great. And the topic of sustainability is always discussed nowadays. I mean, are there any indications on how this plant is or could be helping the environment at all? Either
yes, it's a crop that could be part of a sustainable production system. It doesn't wear down the soil. Any good organic farmer knows how to knows how to maintain the soil health and use the soil health as a way of protecting the crop and replacing insecticides and disease prevention. So cannabis can fit into that regime. It could be part of a sustainable crop system.
I'm glad that's coming to light, and we're taking advantage of that now.
Yep.
And I guess, the next question, I'll leave it open-ended to you. I'm just curious about what excites you in the space right now, what you're primarily most excited about with the research that's coming forward in your study.
Sure. Okay. Well, what's going on here at UConn is, so we're studying, we're applying a basic understanding of plant biology to cannabis. So, for example, we studied how other plants, including tomato, make trichomes. Trichomes are little hairs on leaves or flowers. I don't know if you have ever seen a tomato leaf up close, but you'll see little hairs. And in fact, those hairs have compounds in them that protect the leaf against insects, diseases, so on and so forth. So cannabis produces all of its terpenes and cannabinoids in these hairs, in these cells that are at the top of each hair. They're called globular trichomes. So we know the messages in the plant, hormones and other factors that activate trichomes. So, for example, we could, once we recently increased cannabinoid production by 20% simply by giving a signal to activate the trichome production gene. So we're learning how to apply molecular understanding to cannabis. This hasn't been done in the public domain for decades. There's been a black cloth put over scholarship in cannabis. So that's one thing we're doing. We're also learning, my colleague at UConn, his name is Dr. Yi Lee, we're collaborating, and he's a great bioengineer, and he's developed techniques to insert CRISPR into cannabis. CRISPR is the technology that allows you to edit genes without making a transgenic plant. So with that kind of technology, for example, we could simply edit the THC gene and block it so that hemp growers would no longer have to fear if their flowers go over 0.3% and they have to lose their whole crop. About 20% of the hemp grown that I'm aware of ends up being over the legal limit, and the crop has to be destroyed. So it's a big problem. We can go in and edit the gene and be done with it. We can edit the genes for pollen so that the pollen are infertile. So you don't have to worry about sending people out to kill male plants. We can alter the terpene profile. We can block THC and CBD to let accumulate a new cannabinoid, CBG, or we can direct carbon to CBC. So there's a lot of things we could do to tailor the plant with this kind of scholarship and research.
Now, do you mind clarifying real quick, when you say direct the carbon to CBC, what does that exactly mean?
Well, the cannabinoid biosynthetic pathway starts with precursors from pathways coming from aromatic amino acids, from fatty acids. So all of these precursors are built into very elaborate, complicated molecules, cannabinoids. And there's a pathway in the cannabis plant of enzymes that are coded for by genes that takes these precursors to make a root cannabinoid. The first cannabinoid that's made is CBG, and then CBG is used to make THC or CBD or CBC. So we can manipulate the pathway to favor or prevent any of the steps. So we can shift the movement of precursors to favor different cannabinoids. Does that explain it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
No,
Now, in terms of another phrase that people might be familiar with, or a set of phrases, full spectrum, broad spectrum, and isolate. If you could just describe a little bit what the differences are in the entourage effect that you mentioned earlier, does that attach to one of those rather than the others more prominently?
Yes. Well, first of all, research in the United States has been limited quite a bit about CBD. So a lot of this research was not done in the United States. Israel is one of the leaders in an Israeli scientist discovered the cannabinoid receptor and discovered THC as binding to the cannabinoid receptor. So Israel has a long history of research work in this area. And what Israeli scientists have shown is they've set up assays for things like cancer. So they'll have cancer cells growing in petri dishes. And or other things like some diseases, they have models for a certain disease, like irritable bowel syndrome. And what they'll do is they'll apply a purified cannabinoid like THC or CBD, or they'll apply an extract from the flower, which will have many cannabinoids and many terpenes. And they can fractionate that extract to include only part of the terpenes or part of the cannabinoids. So what happens is scientists have published papers showing that when you deliver a combination of terpenes and cannabinoids as an extract, that has a better effect on the disease target than an individual cannabinoid.
So that perhaps speaks more to full spectrum than
Right.
broad spectrum or isolate, in other words.
Yeah,
Terrific,
that's what I'm
terrific.
speaking about.
Well,
Okay.
terrific. So thank you so much. And on behalf of Vesque Luxe, I want to thank you again, Gerry, for joining us,
Okay.
and good luck with your research and pioneering courses. And we certainly look forward to hearing more about what you and UConn are up to.
Thank you very much, and good luck with your podcast. And I look forward to hearing more of your success.
Great. Thank you so much,
Take
Gerry.
care. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.